Hi, I'm Nancy Matthews, a member of the UPI retiree chapter and former chapter chair, president at NEIU. This short video is to give you an overview of the campaign for equitable funding for public universities. I'm going to give some brief background and invite you to get involved. A few years ago, legislation created the Illinois Commission on Equitable Public University Funding. The commission was charged with recommending solutions to current funding, define a target for adequate funding for public higher ed in Illinois, since none exists, come up with a way to address inequities in the current way funding is provided through appropriations, which do not take into account different institutional needs, and recommend cost adjustments that reflect the needs of different kinds of institutions. The legislature asked the commission to address disparities in access, affordability, degree completion, and especially to focus on systemic and historic racism in the funding patterns. The underfunding of higher education in Illinois compared to other states, and the increased reliance on tuition compared to which has resulted in increased debt for students. The commission did extensive research and published its report in March of 2024. This resulted in legislation that was proposed last October, but didn't pass before the session ended. In late January 2025, House Bill 1581 was introduced to keep this legislation moving. The sponsors of the original legislation were Senator Kimberly Lightford and Representative Carol Amons, and she is the one who introduced the new bill, HB 1581. Senator Lightford, by the way, is a graduate of Western Illinois University and UIS, both UPI institutions. This really does represent historic legislation because it would lead to evidence-based, adequate funding for public higher ed. Let's explore the need a little bit more. This table shows what many of us have experienced and observed, and that is the drop in funding from the state. Now, this shows only the years 2015 to 2023, and we know that the cuts started long before that. Just in this short period, funding has been cut by between 21 to 25%. If you go back to 2000, the drop in funding is about 46%. So we're calling on lawmakers to rethink higher ed funding under the twin needs of equity and adequacy. Yes, this would cost a lot of money, but it's an investment in keeping college students in Illinois where they can become future taxpayers. A core idea behind the adequate and equitable funding model is to use data to analyze what is needed to fund our institutions enough to fulfill their missions. Our institutions vary in who they serve and what their missions are, whether they're research-heavy, public service-oriented, emphasize the arts, etc. Students with varying backgrounds have different needs for support. Institutions need to maintain basic components of a functioning university, such as libraries, core academic programs, etc. And they need to be able to provide what their students need to thrive. All of that informs the adequacy target that you see on the left in this diagram. Then the model looks at the resource profile of each institution. How much is their state appropriation? What's an equitable share for students to pay? What other resources does the institution have? From that, the model looks at the gap between the need and the resources, and the funding model is designed to address this gap. What does this analysis show about our current state institutions? The orange sections at the top of each of these bars shows the adequacy gap. The numbers across the bottom show the percentage that is currently funded. These range from 92% for UIUC to the very low 39% at NEIU, And as a recent retiree from there, I can say this data really validates our experience of austerity. Here's some additional context and consequence. Illinois has historically funded higher education at lower rates than other states. The graph on the left shows the percent of state revenue spent on higher education. You can see the national average is up between 14 to 16% and has been fairly steady, while the Illinois rate has always been below that and has plunged over the last 30 years. The graph on the right shows how this has shifted the cost to students via higher and higher tuition. The legislation that has been proposed includes these goals: adequacy and equity, of course, and then stability, which all of our institutions need, and we all want accountability so that funding is used fairly. Equity is one of the core goals, and equity can be complex. So let's review what's included in that. We've entered a political period in which the very concept has become fraught and suspect. Equity in this proposal is based on evidence. Here are some of the factors that the research has taken into account. As you can see, it includes expected socioeconomic and racial ethnic factors, but also some that most people might not associate with equity, such as the rural-non-rural gap. These factors would be used in the model to consider what additional supports students need at institutions that serve students with these backgrounds. For example, do they need more robust financial aid counseling? Do they need more hands-on advising? Do they need more mental health supports for students who've survived extensive trauma? Do they need more resources for staff and faculty professional development in culturally responsive practices? Our job through the UPI campaign is to further the conversations about this issue, calling on lawmakers to prioritize equity and adequacy in their thinking about how to fund our public 4 years and make a commitment to bringing Illinois to the level that it should be. What can you do? The main thing is to tell your story about the needs at our different institutions. Here are some of the actions that you can take. Your chapter leadership will be contacting you by email or calls to ask you to help, so watch out for these messages. Thank you for listening to this little overview, and if you have questions, you can contact the people who send you the emails.